Hey tech writing students, here's a quick video on doing research and especially a little bit on evaluating research. As we're in this research-based project, I thought it would be probably a good idea to take just a moment to discuss why do we even do research? Like, what's the benefit of it? Of course, you have to do it because it's required for an assignment, but why do all these mean professors make you do stuff like research? Well, came across a really good video, and if we were meeting face to face, I would share this video with you. But I'll just summarize it very briefly. It's a video put together by the Seminole State Library, and their whole purpose was to explain the link between doing research in an academic context versus doing research in a real world context. Now, and I have the link here, and I'll have the link on the Blackboard site. But the basic idea is this: when you're doing the things for classwork, it's supposed to prepare you, give you the skills that you can then transfer to a more realistic, real world situation. So, like for example, they list 5 different steps for doing research. The first step is to identify what type of research or what type of information you need. And so in an academic context, you do this by coming up with a thesis statement, doing exploratory research, that kind of stuff. Stuff that we're doing for our project. And then for a real world scenario, it might be for a different purpose, maybe a very, common purpose, maybe something some of you guys have even already done, but you still kind of have to do your research. It just looks a little different. So you develop sort of a search strategy, some criteria for where you're going to look or what types of houses for buying a home. And then same thing, we've probably all done this once or twice, where you've got a weird pain in your body somewhere, and so you're trying to find accurate medical information, what kinds of sites you'll look at, what kind of information you need to find for that. Same is true when it comes to the finding step, actually finding the information. And in an academic context, you use library databases, you use certain keywords, you check off the options for scholarly sources versus popular sources. In a real world context, that can involve, using resources from a local library for like old news articles, certain records about things. The video mentions, genealogical records, or you might go to the courthouse to look up information on, current laws or rules or principles or whatever it is, codes, and to be able to make decisions about your property or to figure out how to fight some unfair law or something like that, some sort of unfair violation, something like that. And then as far as evaluating, which we're going to talk about a little bit more here, you want to make sure the information is good, and that involves double checking multiple articles for citations and using some of the criteria we're going to talk about in a second. And then in a real world context, it's more about evaluating whether or not someone's trying to, pull the rug over your eyes. In a very topical example, it could involve, fact-checking politicians, right? Or reading news stories and double-checking them to make sure that they're accurate. When it comes to application, using the information or integrating the information, in our case, right, that could be quoting and paraphrasing and summarizing the facts in a paper. In the real world context, it might be using the information to propose a new strategy for something in a business. You might cite experts or, opinions from people who, have done a lot of research on it to be able to convince business partners to do something, to change the way something is done. We try and meld those two things together in English 108, but, sometimes it can still feel much more academic. But that might be how you use it in a real world context as well. You might do a little bit of research, see what other people are doing, and say they're doing it and we should do it too. Again, that's very similar to what we're actually trying to do with this research project. The last thing that you do with your research has to be to acknowledge. You got to give credit for the information. And so in an academic context, we do that through citations and works cited. But in the real world, it's just, about making sure that you're not accidentally stealing information, that you're violating copyright laws, or that you know the difference between what's fair use and what's copyrighted, or that you would have to pay somebody to use. Obviously, if you've got any kind of like web presence or something like that, I made this mistake when I was a young writing intern. You can't just take whatever you want and then put it on there as a cool little marketing thing. Just the other day, I came across this article, and it's put out by the World Health Organization, and it was talking about this concept about misinformation that it calls the infodemic. and I won't get into all the technical jargon or whatever, that's not really important, but I just thought it was interesting that this credible, verified organization thought it was a good idea to just help people understand, here's what you can do to essentially evaluate sources. And so this is obviously a very real world context. I won't get into all the details for what they're probably responding to, but it's just really good info here about the different steps that you take to evaluate the sources. You assess the source from where the information came from, and they're talking about it in kind of a social media context as well, I think. They're telling you to read the article, go beyond the headlines, to try and identify an author, to see if they're real or credible. That's a very common thing that we do for research projects in English classes. Check the date for currency, same idea that we like to do. Examine the supporting evidence to see if they've got facts or citations. Again, we're going to talk about that in just a second. To check biases, to see if your biases are affecting whether or not it's trustworthy. That's always a really important thing when you're dealing with real world stuff. If it's something that you're naturally going to agree with, you have to kind of take a step back and say to yourself, well, wait a second, am I just believing it because I want to believe it, or is it because it's true? And then you kind of verify by double checking it. You just check, like it says there, trusted fact-checking organizations, and just see if it's being reported by other kind of credible sources. That'll usually give you good information there. It's a really good article about just, eliminating as much misinformation as possible, so it will also be linked for you if you're interested in just taking a minute to read it. Really good. Lots of good graphics too. Kind of bringing you back to our class and what we're going to do for the week. We're going to do a exercise that utilizes the very funnily named crap test. So the whole idea with the crap test is that you look at 5 different items in a source, and depending on how well you can find these things and how well you can determine that these things are handled in the appropriate way, you can use the source. There's no cutoff, right? The crap test that you'll see on Blackboard has like a score sheet or something. We're not going to worry about score sheets or anything like that. There's no minimum score it has to achieve. But in general, you should be able to look at some of those questions on the crap test and just say, yes, this seems like it's doing most of what it needs to do, so that I can feel comfortable with it. And if you can't find a bunch of that stuff, then you really have to question whether or not it's good. Just real quickly, crap test, the whole idea with the crap test is that you look at these things, they all start with a different letter of the word crap. You've got currency, which doesn't mean that it has to be recent to a certain date, right? I will not put some sort of like mandatory recency date on there of within the last 5 years, but obviously it needs to be recent enough that it still applies to the situation. Most of you guys are going to choose topics that are very current. And so it makes sense that you'll want current stuff and not stuff from like the 1990s. Relevance, obviously it has to be about your topic specific focus. Authority, that's where we talk about credibility. Credibility of the author, if possible. Sometimes there won't be an author listed. Does that mean you can't use it? No, it does not mean that. But it means that you then need to make sure that the publication has a lot of credibility. That helps determine whether the authority is good. Accuracy, this is one's going to be really, really important, because just because something is said in an article doesn't make it true. We want to make sure that it's really accurate based off of where they're getting their information, whether they mention how they came about it. It's always very helpful, of course, if it's cited, if it's referenced, if there are hyperlinks to other studies or articles that show where they're getting their stuff. And then the purpose. The purpose is really important, because if the purpose is that it's like a more opinionated editorial piece, you have to weigh that with a certain amount of skepticism. Same thing if it's to entertain, or if it's a parody or something like that. You can have interesting information in something that's more entertaining, but we have to make sure that it's quality, or to put it another way, sometimes you have to wonder how carefully they're checking it if the whole point is just to make somebody laugh. So just be aware of that as far as the crap test goes. You just kind of check it against those 5 criteria, and it'll help you figure out whether or not it's a good source. And that's something you're going to have to do for class this week, and you should do with all your sources. One other thing that might be helpful to think about when it comes to evaluating sources is our book talks about this idea of triangulating data, and we do that for evaluation purposes as well. And I mentioned the idea of double checking. It's the same principle. You find something really interesting in one source, and you just check another source to see if it kind of agrees that it has a similar idea, similar conclusion, similar data, and that helps to ensure the credibility of both sources. So, for example, let's say I have one source and I'm working on this topic about cell phones in the classroom and whether or not they're a real distraction and something that teachers need to be more aware of and figure out a way to fix in some way. You know, huge topic, something that teachers have been talking about for the last 20 years. And so let's say I find some data from a research institute that shows that students who look at their cell phones during classes do worse on the following up tests and assignments. Okay, that's a really good source, and that seems to prove my point, but it's not a good idea just to go in with one source. What I need to do is find another source, and let's say I have another source from a surveying project that reveals that students who admit to using their phones in classes do not retain information as well. So that's not the exact same finding, but it's similar enough that you can put together a pretty convincing case that it's having a bad effect on students' memory or their performance when it comes to tasks like tests and quizzes. So I really encourage you to do that with your sources that you have to have for this project. You have to have at least 5 for this semester. And as far as it goes, you want to find stuff that's looking at things from different angles, but also spots where the sources really agree with each other, because that shows that you're finding like really quality information. Technical Communication Today mentions gathering data from print and electronic and empirical sources, and then you triangulate that all together. That's where the triangle idea comes from, those 3 different types of sources. We're not going to worry about that just for the sake of logistics and time. The important thing is just that it comes from different places, different organizations, different studies, and not just the same study repeated on 3 different websites, which happens all the time. You can go to a news article and it says, big study about the latest health craze, and then you're like, as originally reported by CNN, and you go to CNN and they say as originally reported by such and such. You just can go down this rabbit trail and you realize that it's all coming from this one kind of strange, unproven source, but because so many different organizations have reported about it, it makes it seem like it's more credible than it actually is. So watch out for that kind of stuff. The last thing I wanted to leave you with before wrapping up this little review is just the idea about works cited information, MLA works cited. And so there are some resources on the Blackboard site from the VU Writer's Handbook and from Purdue OWL, but I thought I would just kind of give you an overview of the things that might go into a works cited page citation, because you have to have that this week. So an author is usually the first thing if listed. A lot of websites don't have authors listed, so what you might actually do is you might start with the title of the source if there is no author listed. But it goes author, and then the title of the source. The title of the source would be the title of the article, the title of the essay, the title of the post, the title of the documentary, the title of the video, whatever. Then you have what MLA calls the title of the container, which would be the book, the website, the journal, and that's always italicized. The title of the article or whatever is always quoted. Then any other contributors, if present, so that would be editors or translators, performers, sometimes narrators if it's a documentary. Version and number is usually just for print journals. Most of you guys are probably going to stay away from those print sources, at least that's how it goes in the past. The publisher and sponsor, that's only if they're listed and only if they're different from the site or the organization that's a part of the container. So like CNN.com is usually also the website and the sponsor, so you don't need to list it twice. Publication date, pretty self-explanatory, as specific as you can find. So sometimes that's a particular day even, sometimes it's just a year, whatever they have listed on their page. And then the location information. That's page numbers if it's a print source, or it's a web address for an online source. I've included a little template here down at the bottom of the slide of stuff that might go in there. Use it in good health. Hope all of this information is helpful. Of course, email with any questions. mnorman@binu.edu.